Hi, Dr. Yass here. I feel it's time to make the most glaring logical argument regarding the use of the MRI to identify the cause of pain. For most of you, this has become a culturally accepted mechanism which has been utilized over 3 decades, since the 1980s. And the premise is that structural variations, such as herniated disc, stenosis, arthritis, meniscal tears, spondylolisthesis, compression fractures, all these structural variations found on MRIs are the cause of pain. And therefore, since the MRI is performed at the time of pain for the first time and the structural variation is identified, this means that the structural variation is the cause of pain. My question to every individual, every person that has the capacity to address healthcare from a legislative component, people who analyze healthcare from an economic stand, people who have never been in pain but have been affected financially by the situation, I have a very simple question to ask, and I believe it truly captures the whole understanding of why the MRI is not valid and why this simply has to end. And the question is, did herniated discs exist before the MRI was utilized? It's a simple question. The MRI was created in the 1980s. From that point forward, herniated disc, stenosis, arthritis, pinched nerves, all of it has been identified and used as the cause of pain. The question is, prior to the advent of the MRI, did herniated discs exist? Now, if they did not exist before, and that's why they were never treated, then that is to say that simultaneously, at the time the MRI was invented, there was some sort of altered gravitational force, maybe it's climate change, but something has led to herniated disc, stenosis, and arthritis all coming to fruition at the time the MRI was created. I guess that is a possibility for some. But if that is not a possibility to others based on logic, then clearly throughout the history of mankind, prior to the ability to identify structural variations, they existed. Herniated disc, stenosis, arthritis, all of it clearly had to have existed before the MRI and before the identification of the structural variation. If this is the case, and these structural variations did exist, but were unable to be identified, where was the massive level of pain that you would expect from the structural variations that you are being told today is the cause of pain? There is no question that the rise in the number of people suffering from chronic pain began at the time the MRI was initiated and the medical establishment started to utilize those findings to treat pain. The number of people utilizing prescription pain medication clearly jumped meteorically when the MRI became the standard and structural variations became known as the cause of pain and began to be treated. Prior to the 1980s, prescription pain medications such as morphine were typically only used for hospice patients, very rare occasions. There weren't 22 million people addicted to prescription pain medication before 1980. There is no question that from a logical perspective, herniated discs and structural variations existed before the MRI, and yet they were not creating pain. Because if they were, what you would have seen was a massive 70-80% of the population having pain that was uncontrollable because no one could identify the cause. And once the MRI was utilized and the wonderful structural variations were identified, there should have been a massive drop in the number of people suffering from chronic pain. The use of prescription pain medication, which would have been rampant prior to this, would have ended because now you were addressing the cause of the pain. It is the exact opposite of what has happened in real life. The evidence is overwhelming. Forget medical. There's nothing medical about this argument, about this preposition. It is purely logic. I defy any person with any sense of logic to be able to convince me that it is only at the time that the MRI existed that herniated disc, stenosis, pinched nerves, and all these structural variations began. Just at that time. And that they didn't exist before that. And that's why nobody had pain prior. That is an insane argument. There is nobody with any sense of logic that could possibly accept that. Clearly, these structural variations existed and do not cause pain. And that's why, prior to the MRI, they were never identified, never treated, and therefore, the rise in pain, those suffering from pain, began to grow. You have one chance at this point. One chance alone. And that is to recognize that there is no theoretical basis for the use of the MRI. It is baseless. Just on this principle alone, clearly, herniated disc, stenosis, arthritis, structural variations all existed prior to the MRI. It is an unequivocal fact. And yet, there was not the level of pain, even in the remotest sense, compared to where we are today, now that the MRI is finding structural variations, and those are being treated. People are being destroyed by what is happening in the health insurance area, and there is this false sense that all costs have risen and that all costs are justifiable, and therefore there's nothing left to do except try to figure out how to address the cause in a more economical manner. The reality is that since the 1980s and the use of the MRI and the beginnings of treating structural variations has led to the rise in costs of chronic pain, which has now put it above the cost of treating cancer, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease combined. The number of people suffering from chronic pain has risen meteorically. The number of people addicted to prescription pain medication has risen meteorically. Suicide rates, risen. Divorce, all of it. And what's so critical to understand is even if you haven't been affected by one iota of pain, your life has been affected in ways that you don't even realize because of the fact you don't have the understanding as to why healthcare costs have gone out of control to the point where nobody can afford healthcare anymore. And it doesn't really matter what particular politician or economist discusses it. That's not going to change anything until the core principle has been ended. This is overwhelming evidence. I defy anyone to look at this and tell me that what I'm saying is untrue. If there is any chance to end the suffering of those who are having chronic pain, this is the answer. If there's any chance of ever being able to end this ridiculous healthcare crisis issue, which has already affected pretty much every other country, they just went on to ration care as a way of addressing it. This has to be addressed. Anyone who sees this should pass it on, should share it with somebody else who might be suffering from chronic pain. Pass it on to someone who's in a position to have an impact on the financial constraints that this mechanism has put on the people of the United States and the world. Think about the concept. It's very clear. The MRIs created in the 1980s, herniated disc, stenosis, and arthritis are all identified. They begin to be treated as the cause of pain. The simple question is, if they were causing pain, if they cause pain, then clearly, prior to the 1980s, before there was a capacity to identify them, the number of people suffering from pain should have been meteoric. Should have been. 70, 80, 90% of the population have herniated bulging discs, arthritis, all of it. Why didn't 70, 80, 90% of the population have pain to the point that the use of prescription pain medication would have risen to the equivalent of where it is today? The idea that somehow they didn't exist prior to the 1980s and that some weird environmental change occurred to allow the structural variations to begin just at that time? If you want to believe that, God bless you. I don't know what to tell you. Clearly, they've existed throughout the history of mankind. And yet, people were not in pain. They never got treated for this. And they lived quite happily without ever knowing that structural variations existed. That's my position. That is the position of any logical person. And it is only a question of whether enough people will be able to join together and create enough awareness in the positions where it really counts, government or the insurance industry or the medical industry, that will allow this insanity to end. If this makes sense to you and you want to find an alternative, you could go to the Yass method. It is a method that actually looks to interpret the body's presentation of symptoms as a way of identifying what tissue is eliciting the symptom versus the use of MRIs. As far as I'm concerned, they should be abolished. It's clearly a baseless mechanism. If you want to get more information about the Yass method, you can go to www.mitchellyass.com. You want to call me, 516-449-1359. You want to email me, drmitch@mitchellyass.com, drmitch@mitchellyass.com. Folks, I don't know why I was given the capacity to think in the way I do, but it is evident. Any bit of logic will tell you I'm right. And it will not be until this is remedied that people will be able to have their pain resolved, and there will be a capacity to which proper healthcare can be provided and cost controlled by utilizing a system like the Yass method to resolve pain. For now, this is Dr. Mitchell Yass wishing you a pain-free, fully functional life. Bye-bye.